and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey, and sometimes I see a bunch of comments sort of like this. Someone saying something like, I keep building things and following tutorials, but I don't know if I'm actually learning. This is a pretty common thing just because life is not really like a video game, so you can't really look at some kind of XP bar above your head. You can't really see, am I getting the experience or not? Although, by the way, when it comes to learning over here, this part right here is crucial, the building part. If you are just following tutorials, just blindly watching them, that will not work, you won't really gain anything. I made an entire video on this topic on why you should stop blindly watching tutorials, meaning just watch it and don't actually do anything. If you do that, you won't really learn. The building part right here, this one is really crucial. If you really want to learn, you have to apply what you're learning. That's why I made all of the interactive exercises in my C# course. These force you to actually apply what you're learning within each lecture. So by doing this, you make sure that you are actually learning. So anyways, the building part is really important. But assuming you are building things, how do you know, are you actually learning something? Well, there's actually one very simple exercise that you can do that I'm going to do right here. You can open up your own old projects, and if you have indeed grown quite a bit, you should be able to pretty much instantly spot the differences, instantly spot everything that you were doing badly back then, and much better nowadays. Now in my case, I've been making games for over 20 years now, so I've got a lot of projects from a very long time ago that I can just go ahead and look and compare to see the code quality back then compared to right now. And my very first Steam game was this one, it was Survivor Squad. So this one I published it all the way back in 2013, so that was 12 years ago. And I still have project files, I still have backups, so here it is. And we can see, yep, the date modified and all of these, yep, it's 2013. So this is the original project that I did back then. I've got the project open up over here in Unity, and I can actually go ahead and see what exactly was the code quality back then, and how much different it is nowadays. This game is actually decently complex. It is a strategy action game where you control up to 4 survivors, and it's a world full of zombies. So you basically walk around from city to city, from building to building, and you go in, you basically take your survivors, you loot those buildings, get a bunch of items, then zombies come in, and the whole thing is how it's all about line of sight. So basically you have to face your survivors forward. If basically a zombie comes from behind, you don't see it, so you have to control all the various survivors, make one point this direction, one here, in order to make sure you don't have any blind spots. So even in terms of game idea, I do still think the game is really nice. And it does have a relatively high amount of relatively complex mechanics. My main skill set has always been as a programmer, so that is why my games are very much programming heavy. I made this game before I actually read the book Code Complete. This is an absolutely excellent book. I highly recommend all of you read this. If you want to improve your own programming skills, I highly recommend you read this. It's a massive book. This is like 900 pages. But if you do manage to go through it, and if you actually pay attention, I guarantee your code quality will improve 100x. The book really is that good. That is definitely my recommendation. Seriously, I'm not sponsored. There's no affiliate, nothing whatsoever. I really highly, wholeheartedly recommend this book. It has definitely helped me quite a lot in improving the quality of the code that I write. So that means over here on the project files, I've got a ton of scripts to inspect and see exactly the code quality that I was writing back then. So here, let's see a whole bunch of things that I used to do back then that I definitely would not do nowadays. Nowadays, with the level of experience that I have, I can see all of these mistakes that I used to do back then. So right away, here is the survivor handle class. So this is the one that handles the survivor, so it's basically the main class. And right away, just at a glance, I can see a whole bunch of things. Then if I scroll down, I start seeing a lot more things that I would not do nowadays. So yep, just at a quick glance, I can immediately tell that I've grown quite a lot since the time that I wrote this. So that's why, like I said, you definitely should make this exercise. Because if you have grown quite a bit, you should be able to pretty much instantly see all the things that you did back then that you would not do nowadays. For example, the first thing that I see is a mixture of public and private fields. If you've been following my channel for quite a while, you should have already heard me talking about how you should not make everything public. In fact, you pretty much almost never should make everything public. The reason is because when you make something public, you are enabling both read and write access to that particular thing. And if you make fields public, that means that field can be basically modified in any way by any class in your entire codebase. So if your codebase has, let's say, 1,000 classes, that's 1,000 possible points where that one particular field might be modified. Any of those can do any kind of modification, and any modification might actually end up breaking things. So that is why you should pretty much never make your fields public. They should be private with exposed functions if you need to expose them to other classes. You should expose just a get function or a get and a set if other classes are meant to modify it. But most of the times, pretty much all the time, fields should be private, so these right here being public, this should not happen. And based on the name, like here the circle mesh, the light mesh, and so on, I'm assuming that I made these public just to be able to drag the references in the editor. If you make something private, then over here in the inspector, that field will not show up. Whereas if you make them public, they do show up. But instead of making them public, if you do intentionally want to expose that field in the editor, if so, then you should make it private and just add the attribute serialized field. If you do that, then this one stays private, meaning stays safe from every other class in your codebase, but by being a serialized field, that means it is exposed in the editor. So if that's the goal with making it public, just exposing it in the editor, then always make sure you do this and never make it public. The other thing that I can see pretty much instantly as soon as I open this file is something that is insanely important, which is having inconsistent naming rules. So like this, here are a whole bunch of fields. Note how this one over here, this one is using camel case, so it starts off uncapitalized. Whereas this one over here, this one is starting off capitalized, so this one is using Pascal case. Now perhaps you could make the argument, perhaps that was me following some kind of different rule for public fields versus private fields, but nope, this one is public and it has camel case, and this one is public, this one has Pascal case, this one is also public, this one is camel case, so yep, definitely no consistency whatsoever. In my C# course, I have a lesson on naming rules. This is a very, very important lesson. Naming rules are extremely important. For beginners, might not seem like that it's that important, it's really just a name. But in reality, it is something that is very, very important. Back then, back when I wrote this, I probably didn't think this was important whatsoever. But as I started making more and more complex games, I definitely started to learn that naming rules are very, very important. And when it comes to naming rules, it's exactly what I said over here in this video. So here I talked about my own personal naming rules, and I specifically said how you don't have to follow my specific naming rules. You can define whatever naming rules you want, doesn't matter. So here in my case, for fields, I use camel case, but if you want, you can decide that for fields you want to use Pascal case. It does not matter. The only thing that matters is that you are consistent. So define whatever it is the coding style that you like. You can do it based on my own, you can do it based on someone else's, or just you yourself come up with something. And then the really crucial part is make sure you are consistent in applying those rules. So define some kind of code style sheet, and then make sure you do follow it all the time. So there's no such thing as a best coding style. Every coding style can work just fine, as long as you make sure you are consistent. So over here, the fact that I started this one with Pascal case, that is not necessarily the problem, but the fact that this one is in Pascal case and this one is the camel case, that is the one big issue. And same thing, so these are all the fields, but then over here on the function, same thing. So this one is using Pascal case, and then if I scroll down, this one over here is using camel case, this one is camel case, so yep, a bunch of them. So once again, the whole thing is mainly consistency. So define whatever coding style you want, and then importantly, make sure you stick with it. Another thing that I noticed right away that I would not do nowadays is this right here. Here we've got void awake, and this works, this is fine. This compiles perfectly fine, that's good. But over here it does not have the access modifier. Now technically in this particular case, you don't have to write it. So if you don't write over here, it's the same thing as writing private, which is what it should be. So technically you don't have to write it. But personally, again, as a rule, in order to make things nice and clean, because of that, I always like to be very explicit. So technically you can omit this, and technically in this particular case, this will default to private. But one of my rules for writing high quality clean code is to make sure you always explicitly say, so in this case, make sure it is private. Same thing for fields, so on this, technically you can hide it and that will be private. But again, I really think you should be as explicit as possible, that way there's no doubt. I also talked about this in my C# course, the lecture on access modifiers, how I think that you really should be as explicit as possible, because technically there are some cases where if you omit it, it will not default to private. There are some places where if you omit it, it will default to protected or internal, whereas if you are very explicit, if you write it all the time, if so, you know for a fact, okay, this one is guaranteed to be private. Another extremely important thing is something that I've talked about many, many times. You should never have magic numbers in your code. And here's a great example. So here I've got a field for some kind of raycast mask. And over here, I'm doing basically trying to see a bunch of layers that I do not want to hit. So I don't want to hit layer 10, layer 2, 11, 12, and 13. Now the question is, what exactly do these represent? What are all of these layers? And the answer is you can't really tell just by looking at the code. You need to go back into Unity, go into the layers, add a layer, and then over here you can see, okay, so for example, layer 10, that is the empty layer, layer 11, that is object, and so on. So this right here, this is very unreadable code. Magic numbers are basically any kind of number that exists in your code where the intent behind that number is not immediately apparent. So basically in this case, I have no idea just by looking at the code what this raycast mask, what this one is trying to hit or not hit. I don't know what these layers are. In order to figure that out, I gotta go into Unity and see that list. So a much better thing would be over here defining some kind of constant. So constant for like the objects layer equals 10. And then over here, instead of using the 10 magic number, instead of that, I use the objects layer. So now I know, okay, so the raycast, that one is basically doing a bit shift on the objects layer. So I'm doing something with that objects layer. This is much more readable as opposed to just 10, and you have no idea what the 10 represents. So basically make sure you don't use magic numbers in your code. If you need to define some kind of field to represent something, always define some kind of local field or some kind of constant with a proper name that clearly explains what that number is meant to represent, and then use that field directly in your code and never the actual magic number. Another important thing is make sure you don't have old unused comments. So for example over here, so here I commented this code, so I'm doing some kind of load, grabbing it from the resources. Then the shadow, apparently I'm instantiating that load, then grabbing something. So why is this comment over here? If I had to guess, I would guess that I tried some approach of spawning some kind of shadow and doing something, but then I used a completely different method. I'm guessing over here using the shadow handler class. I'm guessing that's what I did back then. I don't know for sure, I just know this code over here is commented. So what happens if I remove this, if this one stops being commented? Does it actually break something? Maybe. So did I leave this comment over here because I was intending to get back to it later on? Or did I leave it because I did something else and this literally no longer is meant to be used? It is perfectly fine to comment things as you are trying out different approaches, So you try out doing something with one method, then you want to try out different methods, so you comment out the first method and do the second one. But then, very crucially, if you do find out that the second method, that one works best, if so, go back and basically get rid of the comments for the first method. Commenting out code is fine once you are doing things, but always make sure once you land upon the final method that you want to use, go back and make sure you clean up all of those useless comments. If not, basically they just stay right here pretty much forever, and now there's no way of knowing, okay, why did I leave this comment over here? Was I going to try to do this at some point in the future? Or did I make something different and this is literally not meant to be used anymore? If that is the case, which I assume that is the case since this game is very old, if so, then all of these comments, all of these should be destroyed. So it's perfectly fine to comment out as you try out different approaches, but at the end, make sure you always remember the very crucial step of cleaning up. So go back and clean up any unused comments, do not leave them over here on the code base just like I have over here. Then here's something that I used to do back then and I definitely would never do it again nowadays. Right here, so here I've got some kind of weapon class, and look at this, I've got a type, which makes sense, the weapon has some kind of type, but the bad part is over here, that type is of type string. Now that is not correct, you should never use strings to identify types. Strings should pretty much only ever be used for text and nothing else. So if you have some text, something like hello world, the string like that, if so, that's fine, that's a string. But if you got some kind of type, like pistol, rifle, and so on, that should never ever be a string. Strings are only meant for text, they are not meant to identify anything. So in this case, I would absolutely never use a string to identify some kind of type. I would use some kind of enum for the weapon type, and then here define some kind of pistol, some kind of rifle, and so on. And then over here, make this field of type of my custom type. And then if I want to assign it, over here, I can just select, okay, it's a pistol or rifle. There are many benefits to this approach. The first reason why strings are terrible identifiers is because they are very easy to make mistakes. So if you write the string pistol, so this is one string, but if you write pistol with lowercase p, all of a sudden this is a completely different string that refers to something completely different. And if you have pistol written like this and pistol with a space at the end, again, completely different thing. So if you were to accidentally write one of the types like this, it would pretty much break everything because pistol does not match pistol. Then of course there are some characters that look similar. So I've got the L right there and I've got a capital I. They look pretty similar. So at a glance, you cannot really see this one does not say pistol. Then you've got, for example, an O, that one can be pretty similar to a 0, or even the L is pretty similar to a 1. So yep, strings are terrible as identifiers because you can make these kinds of mistakes very easily. At a glance, it looks like it might be correct. And if this one is of type string, then this whole thing is going to compile just fine. Because this is a string, it's as much of a string as this one. But of course, if your code says this, then this will not work. And you will find all of those bugs at runtime as opposed to during compile time. Whereas, of course, if you make this of your type, of a custom enum type, and over here I assign this of type.pistol, yep, this works, but if I make that same mistake, I write pistol undercase, and just like this, yep, I've got a nice compiler error because this does not compile, this does not match any of the values within the enum. So the enum itself, that one keeps your type safe. It makes sure that you cannot use the type that does not externally exist in the type itself. So basically, never ever use strings to identify anything. Strings are only meant for one thing, and that is just text. That's it. If you've got some kind of message, hello world, something like that, that is fine, use a string. For literally anything else, do not ever use strings to identify types. And something related to that one is actually another one, which you can see right here. This is something that I used to do pretty much all the time, and nowadays I never ever use this. And it's pretty much for the same reason that I just mentioned, the issue with strings. And it's right here, look at all of these finds. So this is how I used to mainly make my games, with a ton of finds everywhere. So basically just have the script on the parent object, and then use finds to find all of the child objects. I used to do it like this, so my code had tons and tons of finds, but nowadays I never ever use this. And the reason is because exactly the same thing that I mentioned, which is fine, that one is based on strings. So this one over here, if I write the string perfectly, it works, but if I make a mistake right here, all of a sudden it doesn't work, all of a sudden it breaks. Or of course, if I go over here and on the actual game object, if over here I modify that one in order to say something and add a little invisible space at the end, all of a sudden everything breaks, nothing works. I even recently made a short talking specifically about this, about how I used to use find all the time in my code and I completely stopped doing it, and the reason is because of strings. Nowadays, in order to avoid all those issues, instead of find, I really just use a serialized field private. I just use that, then I drag references, and basically I get references to any child object, and this way I am not using strings anywhere in my code. Next thing that I did back then that I would definitely not do nowadays is, look at this, I've got an entire class for global data, and here I've got all kinds of fields storing all kinds of global data. Now, when it comes to global data, I know there are some people that absolutely hate it. They avoid global data pretty much like the plague. And I think that is being a little bit too extremist. There are some cases where using global data makes sense, but definitely not a ton of cases. That should definitely be the exception, not the rule. And over here, as you can see, I'm storing an insane amount of data. So all of this data should definitely not be in just one giant generic global data class. For example, here I've got a boolean to define if I'm playing the demo. I've got some kind of version. Then I also got the game mode that is currently active. I've got the number of rings, so this one has to do with the city generation. There's really no reason why this one should be here on global data. It should be on some kind of city generated class. Then again, same thing, I've got the list of map nodes. So again, that should be on some kind of city generator class and not over here on a global data. Same thing for the infected army. This is the army that exists in the various cities. It should not be here. Same thing for all data for all the survivors in the expedition team, the graveyard, and so on. None of this should be here on some kind of global data class. So always remember, you should keep your code within classes that make sense. And it should be pretty much very, very rare that you use some kind of class that is meant to intentionally be some kind of generic class. For the most part, data should be within a very specific class that clearly describes what that data is meant to do. So nowadays, if I was doing this, I would definitely not put all of this in one global data class. Maybe for some kind of global data, maybe this makes sense, the demo and the version. Even though instead of naming it global, I would name it some kind of like game data, something like that. Then for this, the rings, the maps, the armies, and so on, this should be on some kind of city class. The survivalist, expedition team, graveyard, this should be on some kind of survivor settings class. Then the fog size and the rain intensity, this should be on some kind of game class. Something that runs on the main game scene, so it definitely should not be global data. Same thing for tutorial, this should be in some kind of tutorial handler class. So you have all kinds of things that are over here in one general, generic global data class, whereas in reality, these should all be split up into various classes, depending on where exactly those things are used. Next very important thing that I would definitely not do nowadays is basically just picking semi-random names. Nowadays, I like to have very clear, very descriptive names. So for example, over here, I've got some kind of infected list, and this is a good name. This is a list of infected, so this is pretty much the same name that I would use nowadays. The only thing is I would rename this to be infected like this, but yep, there you go, infected list, that's a good name. But this is not a good name. Why on earth did I name this instead of infected handler? It makes no sense. Just like this, it is objectively a much better name. The name doesn't really say anything, so that makes no sense. And even for diminutives, kind of like this, pause, I'm pretty certain that this one is meant to refer to position. And back when I wrote this code, I didn't like to use those kinds of diminutives. They basically make the code a little bit shorter, so back then I thought that was a good thing. Whereas nowadays, I know much better. Nowadays, I know that being explicit and being very descriptive, that is going to be so much better than being extremely compact. So over here, I would not name this pause, I would name this position. This is a very, very clear name, so position.x, that makes it very, very clear what exactly I'm trying to do. Over here, I've got a function, add possible target, takes in a survivor handler s. Again, no reason to name this as, this should be survivor handler. And now it makes quite a bit more sense. So yep, you should always prefer bigger but more descriptive names, as opposed to something shorter that can lead to quite a bit of confusion. And then just a very general one is basically formatting. So over here, the whole thing is just a mess. So I've got protected fields, I've got public fields, private fields. Why are these all mixed up? That makes no sense. So usually I like to organize them by access modifier. Now, first of all, like I said, I never make things public, but if I did, I would put basically all the publics at the top. Say I put a public over there, another one over there, and like this. Say I put all the publics at the top, then all the protected, then all the private. So just like this, very simple change, but everything already looks quite a bit better. Then also in terms of separating the functions, again, I used to think compact means better, but not really. So nowadays I like to have a nice extra new line between each function. I find that makes it quite a bit more readable. I've got quite a bit more visible space. So I can easily see, okay, this one function, this another one, and so on. Then some things have inconsistent formatting. So over here, I've got a space in between the assignments, and over here I do not. So definitely just a small thing, but it does help. Same thing over here on the plus, make that space. And over here on the material, creating the color, adding some nice spaces. And then just in general, a very obvious code smell is over here on the awake function. This one is doing way too many things. So first of all, this should not be doing too many things. And if it is, then I would usually separate the things by group of logic that I'm doing. So for example, over here, I'm initializing or assigning all the various lists. So I'd put an enter over there just to be able to see it more easily. Again, having some nice visual separation might seem like a small thing. For beginners, might seem like an unnecessary thing. But as you make more and more complex games, you do start to value these tiny things. Because these are tiny, but in the long run, they really matter quite a lot. So yep, here are a whole bunch of things that I did very wrongly back then, back when I was very much inexperienced. So this was over 12 years ago. And nowadays, I would definitely not do this. So the code quality that I do nowadays is much, much better than the thing that I used to do back in 2013. So if this very simple exercise helps me see, okay, I'm definitely 100% certain that I did improve quite a lot from 12 years ago compared to now. And I really recommend that you also do this exercise. Especially if, like I said in the beginning, if you have this kind of question, if you don't know, are you actually learning? If so, go ahead and read your code from just 3 months ago, 6 months ago, whatever you have. Just read that and you should be able to instantly see something very different. And if you do, that is a guarantee that you are indeed actually learning. Alright, so this was interesting, going back and reading my code from 12 years ago. I hope you found it interesting to hear my thoughts. I hope you also take the time to do this exercise yourself. And if you want to learn how to make games, then check out my free complete courses. If you want to learn the super valuable C# language itself, then check out my free C# course. It covers everything from the language from beginner to advanced. Or if you prefer learning how to make a game itself, you can watch my free Catch and Chaos course. That one will teach you how to make a really awesome 3D game. Or alternatively, I just recently released my free Lunar Lander 2D course. So this is a great beginner 2D course. Alternatively, for multiplayer, you can check out my free course on making a simple multiplayer game, or if you're more advanced, then check out my Dots course. This is definitely very advanced stuff, but if you are an intermediate user, then Dots is an insanely powerful tool that I really think you should know. So yep, check out all of those with the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.